So I mentioned this before. Let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Some of the domains were much better at reforming themselves and facing the crises of the late Tokugawa period than was the Tokugawa Bakufu itself. And chief among these domains were Choshu and Satsuma. Choshu, once again, the domain at the extreme western end of Honshu, and Satsuma, the domain at the extreme southern end of Kyushu, which also controlled the Ryukyu kingdom as a vassal state. Great domains, traditional enemies of the Tokugawa, and domains which very much were conscious of the fact that they were outsiders in this Tokugawa system and were very eager, many of their samurai were very eager to reassert their authority. The domains that were especially important and which formed the bedrock, the reforms that were especially important and formed the bedrock of the successful reform programs in general were economic reforms. In Satsuma and Choshu, and also in other domains such as Tosa, to a limited degree, the economies of the domains were reorganized. Tosa domain, for example, had this tradition of the domain government had put up a suggestions box where concerned, not citizens, where concerned subjects could drop off suggestions. And it's very telling that samurai dropped off suggestions saying things like what's really necessary in these troubled times is a return to moral behavior. They explained the economic crisis in moral terms, said we should go back to basics, we should cut off, deny ourselves luxuries, etc., etc. And many merchants instead made suggestions to improve trade, to improve the economic situation of the domain, and made an argument that the profit to the domain was a great value, that there is no shame in making money if you are doing your patriotic duty by your domain. This type of thought became known as kokueki, the profit of the country or the profit of the domain. Remember, koku is a word that can mean anything from country to land to province, depending on the context. Some of these same sentiments took root especially deeply in Satsuma and Choshu. Choshu, for example, the domain was basically taken over by reformers, excuse me, and these launched a radical program of economic reform which streamlined the economy, loosened status restrictions on types of activities you could do, and also did things like reorganize the basically the way that the chief port of Shimonoseki collected income from vessels which passed through, customs duties and things like that, which all of these measures taken together produced a surplus in Choshu, which was an astonishing accomplishment during the late Tokugawa period, when domain after domain and the Tokugawa themselves were drowning in debt. Satsuma also launched economic reconfiguration. In their case, they were fortunate to have access to the revenue stream from the Ryukyu trade, and they really depended on that, especially on the sugar import monopoly. Even today, Okinawa is famous for its sugar, and it's really, really distinctive, great, deep, dark sugar. And it was used as medicine, it was used in cooking, very valuable, and other goods, Chinese goods coming through the Ryukyus. The government of Satsuma became ever better at using these profits, and did a couple of other, launched some other reform efforts as well. And Satsuma found itself with a budget surplus. And both of these domains invested in in their militaries. Satsuma actually, in addition to buying things like these, like Armstrong guns, these were seen as the pinnacle of military engineering during this time period, breech-loading cannons, fast-firing, rifled muskets, even repeating muskets, imported a great deal of firearms, but also the domain government of Satsuma supported the manufacturing of their own firearms. They built modernized factories in Kagoshima. They also experimented with sea power, and Satsuma domain was becoming an ever more viable military force. One other interesting thing about Satsuma is distinct in many ways. Per capita, Satsuma had more samurai than any other domain. In fact, it had a great deal more samurai per capita than any other domain did, basically because the Satsuma samurai establishment, after their defeat by Ieyasu in 1600, never really disbanded many of their retainers. Instead, Satsuma was one of the few places where samurai could farm, and where in fact many of these samurai were indeed farmers in their, well, not in their spare time, but basically farmed to feed themselves. Satsuma was also different in several other ways. Satsuma people had a much more established tradition of consuming meat than did people of other domains. Cow meat certainly was, eating cow meat was a fairly common occupation of Satsuma troops. And this actually gave rise to some stories among their enemies. During 1867, 1868, as we'll see, there was a brief civil war in Japan. The Satsuma samurai found themselves on the pro-emperor side, and there were instances of shogunate prisoners marching through the camp of Satsuma samurai and just being horrified because they had seen Satsuma samurai eating human flesh. Well, what they'd actually seen is they'd seen these Satsuma samurai cooking beef, but it was just such a rare sight to most Japanese people that they just assumed that these Satsuma people were cannibals. Incidentally, eating meat was not unheard of. There was hunting in Japan. When cows died of natural causes, they would be eaten. It wasn't something that was done a lot. It certainly wasn't universally taboo, although as a Buddhist you weren't supposed to do that. But anyway, that's the interesting world of Satsuma. These people who are seen as fierce, as numerous, their samurai did have a very good reputation as fighters. There were a lot of them, and they were increasingly better armed. Choshu was also becoming increasingly better armed, and Choshu did something that Satsuma actually did not do. Choshu bolstered their traditional military samurai bands with new types of units called the Kiheitai, which were mixed units of samurai and commoners, and where promotion and positions of responsibility went to people who showed ability, instead of these units being broken down by precedence or by rank and by status as other samurai units were. These units proved to be extremely effective, very well motivated, very well led, and you can see that they're actually equipped in an interesting way. Remember, we're talking about the mid to late 1860s. There's a great deal of surplus military uniforms lying around all sorts of countries to be sold. Many of the combatants in the Boshin War, this civil war in 1867 and 1868, were actually dressed in Union and Confederate uniforms that were surplus from North America, and other uniforms from Europe as well. They just kind of looks like a mishmash of a little bit of everything. The samurai sword here, you can't really see what that flag is over there, but these are what some of these new units from Choshu look like, and they were very ferocious in battle. One very interesting consideration which I want you to think about was the Meiji Restoration a revolution, or was it a samurai rebellion, much like other samurai rebellions that we have seen before? I mean, on the one hand, samurai did lead the rebellion against the Tokugawa. The Shishi, the domains, the armies of the domains, yeah, there were a lot of commoners who fought in them, especially as time went on, but really the samurai were in charge of these rebellions, were the core of the armies opposing and also supporting the Tokugawa. Also, when we think of some revolutions, for example, the Russian and the French revolutions, we get the sense of a deep and bloody social catastrophe, where in many cases the elite classes of that country are killed off wholesale. Russian and French nobles, some of them survived by staying put and being quiet, but many of them were killed and many of them fled. Samurai were not. The samurai actually stayed in Japan. The samurai, as we shall see, kind of gave up their status as samurai, but they were not killed off. They lived. Also, what is significant is that this samurai government, though the Tokugawa government, though it was overthrown by samurai, it also, the people who came into power were also mostly samurai, as we shall see. So it wasn't necessarily a social revolution in the sense of a new social class coming to power per se, but it wasn't really clear. As we've seen, lower classes did participate in the struggle, and the social structure really did change. Even though former samurai remained in charge of the country, they weren't samurai anymore. Samurai status would be shortly abolished, and that really does matter. Economic life changed. Many of the patterns of by which the social system and the economic system were intertwined, many of these were greatly changed. There was no more sense that merchants were a despised class or that the samurai were somehow superior, morally superior. These old ideological constants were reevaluated. And the status system, the fact that it was abolished, not just for the samurai class, but for all classes, that was a truly significant development as well. So it's not exactly clear if the Meiji Restoration was more of a revolution or if it was a rebellion. There are arguments to be made for both. The opposition to the Tokugawa was not unified. This is very important. Among the various domains that were unhappy with the Tokugawa, many of them were just as unhappy with each other. I've been talking about Satsuma and Choshu, The thing is, these domains hated each other as much as they hated the Tokugawa, or almost as much. They were rivals, and in 1864, a series of events happened, which we'll get into shortly, which kind of pitted them on opposite sides of a shooting war even. So they were not natural allies. And also, the domains themselves were actually far from unified. Reformers who had come to power in domains such as Satsuma and Choshu were increasingly challenged for political power, not by conservatives who wanted to support the Tokugawa, but by radicals who were, they were happy to use Western weapons that the domain government was importing, but who were unhappy with the domain establishment, thought of them as tired old men, unless the domain government took the most radical position opposing the Tokugawa, and this provided a fair degree of political uncertainty even within those domains like Satsuma and Choshu, which were not necessarily friendly to the Tokugawa. And the imperial court was also divided. As important as nobles like the aforementioned Iwakura Tomomi were making contacts with samurai radicals, there were courtiers and members of the imperial family who wanted nothing to do with these crazy, violent fanatics. So it was a delicate situation. Something had to happen to bring the centers of opposition to the Bakufu together. And it took maneuvering by people like Sakamoto Ryoma to do this. Sakamoto Ryoma was a very low-ranking samurai in Tosa domain, in that powerful domain in southern Shikoku that we have brought up several times. Excuse me. His immediate ancestors were actually merchants. His family had bought their samurai status. But this guy became radicalized. He thought that he was absolutely fed up with the Tokugawa officials who he saw were just giving the country over to these Westerners. And his life is absolutely fascinating, and I really wish that we could get a greater, we could go into greater detail about him, but we have to cut it short, and to cut this story short, basically what he and people like him ended up doing was bringing together opponents of the Tokugawa from among the different domains, especially Satsuma and Choshu. He sat their people down. He said, this is why you should cooperate, and also brought in, helped bring in the imperial court to forge something that more or less approached an alliance, a kind of a working group from amongst all of these different power centers, that then formed the core of the restoration. And as this was going on, Choshu domain was increasingly being taken over by radicals who were wresting power even away from reformers, and events in Choshu were to drive, or certainly events involving Choshu samurai, were going to drive, were basically going to usher in the restoration proper.